I've always thought life was supposed to follow a clear, predictable path: school, job, marriage, kids. I believed I had everything in order until I slowly started noticing a subtle change. Over the years, I realized that the woman I married, Amber, was gradually slipping away into herself. At first, it was nothing more than a passing thought, a small, barely noticeable crack in what I assumed was a perfect facade of our life together. I chalked it up to the everyday stresses of life, never giving it the significance it might have deserved. I was so busy living the life I thought I wanted that I overlooked the hints that something was off. I still remember the humid Houston night when we attended that monthly party at Amber's family house. The air was thick with anticipation, and I couldn't help but feel a slight unease in my gut as we arrived. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just another routine gathering, nothing more than a social obligation. But that night, everything changed. Inside the house, the atmosphere was a mix of lively chatter and soft background music that somehow made the entire space feel both inviting and oppressive. Amber mingled with her relatives and old friends with an ease that always made me feel like an outsider. I lingered near the doorway, nursing my drink and watching as she laughed and danced among them. It wasn't that I didn't trust her. It was just that something about the way she interacted with everyone else made me feel like I was losing ground, as if the connection we once shared was slowly evaporating before my eyes. Then came the moment I'd come to regret. As the night unfolded, we moved to the dance floor, a space filled with swirling colors and pulsating beats. I was trying to enjoy the moment, but my eyes kept darting back to Amber. And then I saw him, Jack. It was as if time had slowed down. There he was, a presence I recognized all too well from our past. A ghost I thought had been laid to rest. Amber, usually so composed and careful, allowed herself to be drawn into his orbit. I watched, paralyzed, as Jack stepped in close, pressing against her with an intimacy that was unmistakable. I could see the spark in his eyes, a spark that once ignited a dangerous fire between them, and I felt an icy chill creeping over me. I knew who he was and what he represented, a man from Amber's past who had no place in our life. Yet, even as I stared in disbelief, I noticed something even more painful. Amber didn't recoil or push him away. Instead, she danced with him, her body moving in a way that seemed almost deliberate, as if she were inviting him back into her world. My heart pounded in my chest as I stepped forward, my mind racing with a mix of anger, hurt, and disbelief. I tried to insert myself into the scene, to reclaim the space that I felt slipping away from me. Amber, what are you doing? I managed to say, my voice wavering as I reached out. But before I could even process a reaction, Jack's laugh rang out, a mocking, derisive sound that cut through the music and stung more than any harsh word could. Jack didn't hold back. He leaned in closer, his tone dripping with sarcasm and superiority. "Relax, Michael," he sneered, his hand lingering on Amber's waist as if daring me to challenge him. His touch was brazen, and every moment felt like a public declaration of disrespect. I stood there, frozen between fury and sorrow, unable to comprehend how everything had spiraled so quickly. I tried to push past the humiliation, to muster some form of assertiveness and demand respect for what I believed was mine. But every word I uttered was met with another insult from Jack, whose confidence in that moment only grew with each barb he threw my way. The crowd around us seemed to shrink into a blur, their laughter and chatter only amplifying my inner turmoil. I felt naked, exposed, and utterly betrayed, not just by Jack's audacity, but by Amber's silent compliance. Amber's eyes never met mine during this confrontation. She remained a silent observer to my mounting distress, her face impassive as if she were watching a performance rather than living a moment that was tearing our relationship apart. The silence between us was deafening, and I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. In that moment, I was no longer a part of her world. I was an intruder in a space where I no longer belonged. The final blow came as swiftly as the painful realization that I was being publicly humiliated. With every sneer from Jack, with every dismissive glance from Amber, I felt my sense of self crumble a little more. I couldn't bear to stand there any longer, to watch my marriage unravel in front of everyone. My pride shattered under the weight of the night's events, and with a heavy heart and a mind racing with confusion and betrayal, I turned and walked out. As I stepped out into the cool Houston night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been lost. That party, that night, had been the catalyst for a series of events I never saw coming. The image of Amber dancing with Jack, unchallenged and indifferent, haunted me as I made my way back home. In that moment, I realized that respect isn't just a word. It's a foundation upon which relationships are built. And as I left, that foundation crumbled beneath me, leaving me to wonder how I could ever rebuild it again. I stumbled through the front door around 2 a.m., the weight of the night clinging to me like a second skin. I barely registered the cool rush of air as I kicked off my shoes and headed straight for the kitchen, where I grabbed a cold beer from the fridge. The liquid burned a bit as it slid down my throat, a small comfort against the sting of betrayal that still pulsed in my veins. The house was silent, too silent, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to shatter the stillness. I couldn't sit still, couldn't let the night dissolve into oblivion without taking action. In a haze of anger and sorrow, I began packing. I moved through each room mechanically, collecting a few personal items, a framed photo of a happier time, a couple of books that had once meant the world to me, and stuffing them into a duffel bag. Each item was a memory, each memory a reminder of the life I thought we had built together. I wasn't sure if I was packing up my things or the pieces of a heart that was slowly fracturing beyond repair. 5 long hours passed in this limbo, the silence of the house punctuated only by the rustle of packing and the occasional clink of a bottle being set down too forcefully. Every tick of the clock amplified the feeling of isolation, of being trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I tried to convince myself that I was doing the right thing, that this was a necessary step to reclaim some semblance of control over a life that had just spiraled out of reach. Then, just as I was about to finish, I heard the sound of keys in the lock. The door swung open, and Amber appeared, not with concern etched on her face, but with an expression that betrayed nothing more than habitual indifference. I could see the cool detachment in her eyes as she stepped into the living room, her gaze sweeping over the scattered remnants of my hurried departure. Without missing a beat, she said, almost casually, "So, you're leaving?" It wasn't a question, really. It was more like an observation, as if my absence over the past few hours was as expected as the next day's sunrise. In that moment, it struck me hard. She hadn't even cared to ask where I was or worry about me until now, when the consequences of our fight had finally caught up with us. The realization stung more than any physical pain could have. I closed the bag slowly and looked at her, my eyes searching for some flicker of the woman I once knew. "Amber, why didn't you say anything earlier? Why didn't you defend me when Jack was?" I paused, the words catching in my throat as the memories of that humiliating confrontation resurfaced. The raw hurt of that night was still fresh, a wound that refused to close. "Why didn't you do anything when he was touching you? When he humiliated me?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. She sighed, a sound so devoid of remorse that it sent another shiver of pain down my spine. With a quiet, almost indifferent tone, she replied, "It didn't mean anything, Michael." Those words, simple and dismissive, cut deeper than any insult Jack could have thrown at me. It was as if she had already resigned herself to the idea that what had happened was insignificant, something to be shrugged off rather than confronted. In that moment, I felt a profound loneliness seep in. It wasn't just the physical solitude of the nearly empty house, but the emotional isolation of realizing that the person I had once trusted and loved was now an outsider in the life we were supposed to share. Every carefully packed item, every memory neatly folded away in that duffel bag, was a testament to the crumbling foundation of our relationship. I stood there, staring at her, trying to gauge if there was any hint of regret in her eyes, any sign that she understood the gravity of what had just transpired. But all I saw was indifference, a cool detachment that made it painfully clear that she no longer cared about defending what we had, or about the betrayal that had unfolded right in front of me. The air between us felt heavy, laden with unspoken accusations and the ghost of a night that had changed everything. I realized that in that moment, nothing could bring us back to the way things were. The image of Jack, his mocking laughter, and Amber's indifferent acceptance had etched themselves into my mind, leaving an indelible mark of betrayal. I took another swig of my beer, the bitterness of the alcohol mirroring the bitterness that had taken root in my heart. I tried to speak, to plead for some understanding or remorse, but the words faltered on my tongue. All I could do was stand there, a silent witness to the end of a chapter that had once seemed so full of promise. As the early hours of the morning crept in, I realized that this wasn't just about one party or one fight. It was about the slow, inevitable erosion of trust and love, a process that had been underway long before that fateful night in Houston. And now, with every piece of my life packed into that duffel bag, I was leaving behind not just a house, but a future that no longer held any meaning. In the quiet aftermath, as I prepared to walk away from a life that once felt perfect, I couldn't help but wonder how it had all come to this. The fight, the betrayal, the silence. It was all too much to bear. And as I closed the door behind me, leaving Amber and the fragments of her shattered life in the dim light of dawn, I knew that there was no going back. After leaving the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same. I trudged along the dark, empty streets, my mind a storm of anger, betrayal, and hurt. But nothing prepared me for the shock that would soon unravel even more of the truth. It was barely an hour after my departure when news reached me, through whispers in the neighborhood and frantic phone calls, that Jack had been brutally beaten near a lake just a few miles away. I remember the uneasy pit in my stomach as I learned that he'd been attacked by 3 men, his body left battered on the cold, muddy bank. It was a scene that should have been the last straw in our tangled mess. But the real revelation was yet to come. I wasn't at the hospital, not that night, and in my shattered state, I hadn't even tried to look for Amber. Instead, I replayed every moment from the party, every cold look, every dismissive word, trying to grasp the scope of my loss. But a sudden phone call jolted me. Amber was on the line, her voice unervingly calm. She explained that she had gone to the hospital with Jack, that he needed help, that she was doing what any decent person would do for someone in pain. I froze, my mind refusing to accept the words. How could she be so nonchalant about it all? For reasons I couldn't understand, I found myself driven to the hospital, not to see Jack, but to confront the situation with Amber. When I arrived, the sterile smell of antiseptic and the low murmur of the hospital corridors did nothing to ease the tension boiling within me. I waited outside Jack's room, every minute stretching endlessly as I tried to prepare myself for what I might learn. Amber finally appeared, her eyes distant and devoid of the remorse I so desperately craved. Her calm expression was almost clinical, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the wreckage of our lives. The conversation that followed was a blur of medical updates and curt responses, but it was in a quiet moment, when the nurse had stepped away, that I heard it, a snippet of conversation that changed everything. I overheard Amber telling a nurse, in a tone so casual it was as if she were recalling a trivial detail, "I've known Jack for years, even before Michael." It was nothing serious back then. The words crashed into me like a tidal wave. In that instance, every ounce of betrayal intensified. Jack wasn't just a fleeting shadow from our troubled night at the party. He was someone with a past connection to her, someone she had known long before I was even a part of her life. It wasn't a one-time lapse. It was a part of her history, a betrayal that had been festering long before tonight's humiliating scene. I felt an overwhelming surge of anger, not just at Jack for the confrontation at the party, but at Amber for keeping this secret from me all along. The realization was brutal. Every laugh, every fleeting touch, every moment when I suspected that something was amiss, it all made sense now. This was a betrayal that had its roots deep in the past, a betrayal that had slowly undermined the foundation of our relationship long before the party had ever taken place. I stepped out of the hospital room, my heart pounding with a mix of fury and despair. The fluorescent lights above seemed to flicker mockingly as I replayed every memory, every slight, every moment of indifference from Amber. I couldn't decide which cut hurt more, the fresh wound of tonight's humiliation or the old scar of a secret she had carried for years. In that moment, I realized that what had happened wasn't just a lapse in judgment at a party. It was the culmination of a series of betrayals that had been silently poisoning our marriage. Outside, in the chill of the night, I leaned against the cold brick wall and allowed myself a few unguarded moments of vulnerability. The realization that Amber had chosen to protect someone from her past, someone who had once been so significant to her, left me feeling utterly abandoned. I had believed in us, in the future we'd planned together. But now, every promise, every shared dream, felt like a lie, a beautiful illusion that had been shattered by the harsh light of truth. In that bitter solitude, as I stared into the dark void of the hospital parking lot, I felt a profound sense of loss. It wasn't merely the loss of a relationship. It was the loss of trust, the loss of a shared history that I had thought was built on honesty and mutual respect. Instead, I was left with the stark realization that she had been living a double life, compartmentalizing her past and our present until they collided in a way that left me utterly broken. That night, under the indifferent gaze of the stars, I vowed to uncover every hidden truth, no matter how painful it might be. The road ahead was uncertain and riddled with betrayal. But one thing was clear. I could never go back to the man I was before I discovered the full extent of her deceit. The night was colder than I expected as I drove the winding road that led to the outskirts of the forest. I'd been numb since the revelations at the hospital, each moment of denial now replaced by a simmering fury. The information I'd overheard, the betrayal of Amber that had festered for years, pushed me into a spiral of retribution. I knew I couldn't let Jack continue to haunt my thoughts without facing him. So, with a resolve that surprised even me, I set off to find him. 5 kilometers from our old house, near a dense thicket where the trees seemed to whisper secrets in the darkness, I finally spotted him. Jack was leaning against a weathered wooden fence, his silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to avoid confrontation, but I couldn't. The need for answers, for justice, overpowered any thought of self-preservation. I approached silently, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. When he finally noticed me, his eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and something else. Fear, perhaps. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Jack," I growled, my voice low and dangerous. "We need to talk." His smirk vanished, replaced by a wary caution. Before he could utter a single word, I lunged forward. The adrenaline rushing through me transformed my pain into raw, animalistic fury. In the chaos of our struggle, the sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, seemed to fade into an eerie silence. The fight was brutal and unrelenting. Every punch I threw was fueled by the betrayal that burned inside me. I managed to land a solid blow to his face, but Jack was surprisingly resilient. He countered with a clumsy jab, which I dodged effortlessly, my focus solely on retribution. As the scuffle escalated, I found myself grappling with him near the base of a massive oak tree. With a sickening crack, I heard the sound of bone meeting bone. In the fray, I had managed to break several of Jack's fingers with a series of savage strikes. The pain he felt was mirrored in the fury of my own actions. Desperation crept in as I realized that words alone wouldn't suffice. I needed him to confess everything. With a final surge of anger, I twisted his arm until I felt a distinct pop, a dislocated shoulder that left him gasping in agony. Jack's eyes filled with terror and, for a moment, a flicker of defeat. "Talk, Jack," I demanded, my voice echoing in the cold night air as I held him down. "Where's the truth about Amber? I want to know everything." My grip tightened, each word laced with the venom of betrayal and heartbreak. Under the weight of both my physical assault and the torment of his own guilt, Jack's resistance began to crumble. Through gritted teeth and between tortured breaths, he finally muttered, It wasn't just that one night, Michael. Amber, she slept with me again and again. 6 years, man. 6 years straight. His confession, delivered in a broken whisper, sent a fresh wave of agony through me, the betrayal now fully exposed in the light of brutal honesty. I could barely process his words as he continued, his voice trembling with a mix of pain and regret. We met about once every 3 to 4 months. I wasn't some random fling, Michael. She was looking for an emotional explosion, something to fill the void you left her. And I was there every single time. Every word felt like a blow, as if the confession itself was a weapon crafted to shatter the remnants of my once unwavering trust. My mind raced through every memory, every moment of cold indifference that had haunted our marriage. The infidelity wasn't a recent aberration. It was a calculated pattern, a cycle of betrayal that stretched back 6 long years. The forest, with its silent witness of our violent encounter, seemed to close in around us. The raw, brutal fight had uncovered not just the physical manifestation of my anger, but the deep-seated emotional betrayal that had been poisoning my life for years. Jack lay there, battered and broken, his body a canvas of the violence I'd unleashed. And with every shattered bone, with every spilled confession, I felt a part of me die. I stared down at him, a mix of pity and revulsion swirling within me. The sight of his crumpled form was a stark reminder of the irreversible choices made by both of us. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about a man who had crossed a line. It was about a woman I had once loved, a woman who had willingly traded our future for fleeting moments of passion and chaos. You think this justifies everything? I spat, the question hanging heavy in the cold night air. Jack's silence was the only answer he could muster, his eyes wide and devoid of defiance. The truth was laid bare between us, a bitter pill that neither of us could swallow. As I finally released my grip, stepping back to assess the wreckage of both our lives, the forest seemed to whisper its own judgment. The raw confession, the violent retribution, it all pointed to a truth too painful to ignore. Amber had not only betrayed me in one horrific moment at that party, but she had systematically dismantled the foundation of our marriage over 6 years, using me as a placeholder in a cycle of emotional explosions. I left Jack there, alone in the cold darkness, his confession echoing in my mind like a relentless drumbeat. The forest swallowed him up, much like my hopes had been swallowed by the relentless tide of betrayal. And as I turned to walk back into the night, every step away from that scene felt like a step into an uncertain future, one where trust was shattered, and the ghosts of our past would forever haunt the spaces between what once was and what could never be again. The drive back home was a blur. My knuckles were bruised, my head pounded, and my mind felt like it was spiraling into a void of emptiness. The truth had finally been ripped open like an old wound, and there was no stitching it back together. 6 years. 6 years of betrayal hidden beneath the surface of our marriage, disguised as routine, disguised as love. I parked the car in the driveway and sat there for a long moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. The house stood in front of me, the same house I had built my life around, but now it felt foreign, like a place where only ghosts of broken promises lived. Inside, the lights were still on. Amber was there. She had to know by now that I had gone looking for Jack. Maybe she even knew what I had done, but none of it mattered anymore. I needed answers, not to change anything, not to fix what was irreparable, but just to hear it from her own lips. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me with deliberate slowness. Amber was sitting on the couch, her posture tense, her fingers gripping the fabric of her jeans like she was bracing herself for what was coming. She didn't speak first. She didn't ask where I'd been. She knew. I walked over, standing in front of her. The air between us was thick with everything unsaid, but I had no patience for silence anymore. Did you cheat on me? My voice was eerily calm, devoid of the anger I'd felt earlier. I just needed to hear it. One word. One confirmation that everything I had just uncovered was real. Amber didn't answer. She didn't even try to lie. Instead, she looked down, avoiding my gaze entirely, her lips pressed together in a thin line. Silence. The kind of silence that didn't need words because the answer was already there. I felt something inside me finally give way, like the last remaining thread that had kept me tied to some illusion of hope. My chest felt hollow, my breath shallow. The confirmation, as much as I had already known it, still stung in a way I couldn't quite describe. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and asked the only other question that mattered. "Do you love me?" Amber's eyes flickered upward at that, searching my face for something. Understanding, forgiveness, maybe even permission to soften the blow. But I didn't move. I didn't blink. She took a deep breath, exhaling as if she were about to confess something far heavier than I was prepared for. "I love you, Michael," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But not the way a wife should love her husband. The words landed like a slow, agonizing death. My body tensed as if I'd been physically hit, but I didn't react. I just let the weight of her confession settle over me like a suffocating blanket. "I was always attracted to Jack," she continued, her voice steady but laced with something, regret, maybe. "Physically, there was always something there. But you," she swallowed, shaking her head slightly. "You were the one I truly loved. Not in the way you deserved, but in the way I thought I could." I felt sick. My fists clenched at my sides, not out of rage, but out of the realization that everything I had given to this marriage, to this life with her, had been built on her misguided sense of obligation. "You stayed with me out of duty," I said, my voice hollow. It wasn't a question. It was the truth, and she didn't deny it. Tears welled in her eyes, but I couldn't bring myself to care anymore. I was beyond sadness, beyond heartbreak. This wasn't just infidelity, it was something worse. She had chosen me not because she wanted me, but because I was safe, because I was stable, because I was the life she was supposed to have, while Jack was the thrill she had always craved. I had been the man she came home to, the one who built a life with her, the one she respected, but never truly desired. The realization settled in my bones, cold and unshakable. There was nothing left to fight for. No part of this marriage that hadn't already been destroyed long before that night at the party. I had been losing her for years, and I never even saw it happening. I stepped back, exhaling slowly, feeling lighter somehow, like the burden of trying to hold on to something that was never really mine had finally lifted. Amber watched me, her expression filled with something resembling remorse, but I didn't want it. I didn't need it. I deserved more than this, I said simply, and for the first time, I truly believed it. Then, without another word, I turned and walked away. I didn't say anything else. There was nothing left to be said. The air between us felt heavy, suffocating, filled with every unsaid word, every wasted moment, every truth that had come far too late. I turned away from Amber, my steps slow but steady, heading toward the bedroom for the last time. The closet door creaked open, and I grabbed the half-packed duffel bag from earlier that night. It felt surreal, like I was watching someone else go through the motions of dismantling a life that had already collapsed. I threw in a few more clothes, my hands moving on their own. The weight of finality settled in with every zipper, every item tossed into the bag without a second thought. Behind me, Amber's quiet sobs filled the room. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. "Michael, please." Her voice cracked, thick with desperation. "Don't do this. We can fix this." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Fix this? She still thought this was something that could be mended, as if we hadn't been living in the wreckage of our marriage for years. As if she hadn't already broken everything beyond repair. I slung the bag over my shoulder and turned to face her. Her face was tear-streaked, eyes red and swollen, looking at me like I was slipping through her fingers. But she had let me go long before tonight. "This was a mistake from the beginning," I said, my voice calm, detached. The words came easier than I expected because they were the truth. A truth I should have admitted to myself years ago. Amber shook her head violently, taking a shaky step toward me. "No," she whispered, her hands clutching at the fabric of her sweater like she was trying to hold herself together. "You don't mean that. We were happy once. You love me." I let out a slow breath, my grip tightening around the strap of my bag. Yeah, I admitted. I did. But love doesn't survive in a place like this. I motioned to the room, to the house, to everything that had become a hollow reminder of what we used to be. She broke then, completely. The sobs racked through her body trembling as she reached for me, grasping at my arm, my hands, anything she could touch. Please, Michael, please don't leave. We can fix this. We can go to therapy. I'll make it right. I'll do anything. I gently pulled away from her grip, my heart aching in a way I didn't think was possible anymore. Amber, I said softly, looking her in the eyes, the dead don't come back to life. Her breath hitched, her face contorting in devastation as my words settled into her bones. I didn't wait for another plea, another promise she couldn't keep. I turned and walked out of the room, my steps slow but sure. She didn't follow this time. She knew it was over. The front door loomed ahead, the last barrier between the life I was leaving and whatever waited for me outside. My fingers hesitated on the handle for the briefest of moments before I pushed it open. The night air was cold against my skin, sharp and real, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I stepped out without looking back, letting the door close behind me, not just physically but in my heart. This chapter was over. This marriage was over.